Welcome to Refugee 101 with Colorado Refugee Connect. In this session, we'll explore refugee resettlement and gain a better understanding of the refugee experience. Who is a refugee? To answer this, we'll first need to define refugee status. Humans have a long history of moving from place to place. There are many motivating factors. Some relocate by choice, often in search of new opportunities or improved ways of life. Let's look at different categories of individuals who make their way to America. We'll start with immigrants and migrants. An immigrant, by definition, moves to another country by choice, usually in search of better life opportunities. Immigrants are often reasonably prepared for their moves and typically elect their destination. A migrant is one who willingly travels from one place to another, or one country to another, usually for work or economic gain. Others are forced to relocate as a means of survival, often leaving behind homes, possessions, loved ones, and personal histories as they make their way into the unknown. These include internationally displaced persons, or IDPs, asylum seekers, special immigrant visa holders, or SIVs, and refugees. Internationally displaced persons, or IDPs, make up the broadest category. These individuals are forced to flee their homes, but remain within the boundaries of their home country. IDPs may relocate due to natural disasters or man-made causes such as war. Almost all refugees begin as IDPs. Refugees are also displaced from their homes, but are set apart from other displaced persons in that their flight must be related to war or violence, and they must experience an earnest fear for their life or safety as a result of ongoing persecution. Asylees meet the criteria of a refugee, but are already living in the host country or are seeking asylum at a port of entry. Special immigrant visa holders, or SIVs, are a special status granted to certain foreign nationals who have provided faithful and valuable service to the United States government. Some of these individuals are resettled because their lives are in grave danger in their home countries as a result of their loyal service to the U.S. To review, displaced individuals leave their homes for a variety of reasons, including war, famine, natural disaster, or economic instability. Refugees are unique because, for better or worse, international law requires that in order to qualify for refugee status, an individual must have a reasonable cause to fear for his or her life or safety. This comes from the 1951 Geneva Convention, the outcome of which defines a refugee as one who fled his or her own country because of persecution, or a well-founded fear of persecution, based on race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Ultimately, it is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, who is responsible for determining eligibility for refugee status. The organization ensures 4 critical checkpoints. First, as previously stated, a person must experience a well-founded fear of persecution. Next, he or she must be outside of the country of nationality. He or she must be unable to access protection from the home country and cannot be a national of another country. Each story of the refugee experience is unique. Some travel through multiple countries in search of asylum. In the process of escape, many must place themselves in uncertain circumstances or entrust their lives to smugglers. Some endure periods without food or water. Many flee without important documentation. Some are even forced to leave loved ones behind. The majority of refugees relocate to urban camps, where groups of asylees band together within established cities. Urban camps are often makeshift and may evolve to have their own economies. Some resettle in formal refugee camps, usually organized by the UNHCR. These are the image of refugee camps that most Westerners are familiar with, usually having standardized tent structures and organizational staff. On average, a refugee lives in a camp setting for 17 years. The average duration a refugee spends away from his or her country before he or she is able to return is 20 years. Prior to upheaval, most refugees had no desire to leave their home countries. In fact, this process can be very traumatic. As one saying goes, no one leaves their home unless their home is the mouth of a shark. Once refugee status eligibility has been established, the UNHCR considers 3 durable solutions. 1, a repatriation back into the country of origination. 2, integration into the neighboring country where asylum was sought. And 3, resettlement to an agreeing third-party country. However, less than half of 1% of the world's refugees will ever be resettled to a third-party country. Let's say that again. Less than half of 1% of the world's refugees will ever be resettled to a third-party country. Those that do make it all the way to the United States are truly 1 in a million. Here, in places like Colorado, individuals with refugee paths will rebuild their lives. Now, let's explore some factual data about refugee resettlement to America. First, a startling truth. There are currently more than 65 million displaced persons in the world. Of those, more than 25 million can be categorized as refugees. Colorado is proud to be home to refugees from all over the world, including countries such as Myanmar, Burma, Eritrea, Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, and Guatemala. More than half of the world's current refugee population originated from just 5 countries: Somalia, Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar, Burma. The vast majority of the world's refugees are hosted by developing countries. In fact, these 10 countries resettled more refugees than the rest of the globe combined. Sadly, more than half of the world's refugees are children. Children, and especially unaccompanied minors, are a particularly vulnerable population. Unaccompanied minors are at an increased risk for abuse, exploitation, trafficking, child labor, and physical or psychological harm. Refugee resettlement to America is based upon presidential determination, which is declared ahead of each fiscal year. Prior to the 2018 fiscal year, the United States resettled approximately 2% of the world's resettled refugee population. In the last year, however, resettlement to the United States has curbed dramatically. For the first time since the Geneva Convention officially defined refugee status, America has dropped to the lowest ranking in terms of refugee resettlement out of the 38 third-party countries. In 2018, the refugee admission ceiling was lowered to 45,000, though only 22,491 individuals were actually resettled into the U.S. during that period. For fiscal year 2019, that number has been further reduced to just 30,000. If you'd like to become involved in advocating for healthy refugee resettlement numbers, be sure to check out our advocacy page. Your voice can make a difference. Now, what about beautiful Colorado? Traditionally, about 2% of the refugees who arrive to America are resettled to Colorado. Approximately 60,000 refugees have been resettled to Colorado since 1980. Colorado Refugee Connect proudly engages nearly 50 refugee network service providers, and that's where you come in. How do refugees make their way to Colorado? Let's explore this in 2 main parts: pre-resettlement and post-resettlement. It is important to note that the process of resettlement is a complex one. Resettlement to the United States, in particular, is an intense, thorough, and often lengthy process. Of all categories of immigrants to America, refugees are the most rigorously screened and vetted. Refugee admission to the United States begins with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The UNHCR determines refugee status. This usually occurs in the country of conflict or the region where asylum was sought. In order to confirm refugee status, the UNHCR collects the initial round of documents and biodata, including the first set of fingerprints, and in some cases, iris scans. Again, the UNHCR refers fewer than 1% of all refugees for third-party resettlement. Refugees do not choose their country of resettlement. Candidates who are assigned to the United States for resettlement are referred to a Resettlement Service Center, or RSC. The RSC collects all documentation and creates a file. The third phase is a vigorous screening process that includes multiple federal agencies, including the National Counterterrorism Center, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the State Department. Syrian refugees are subject to additional screening. If, at any point, an individual or family is determined to be a risk factor, the application process is ended. Next, the Department of Homeland Security conducts in-depth interviews with specially trained agents, and updated fingerprints are taken. Any inconsistencies result in the repetition of this step or a full termination of the application process. In the fifth phase, the full biometric screening and evaluation process is repeated. As the application moves closer to completion, each individual receives a full medical evaluation. For those who fail the medical component, the process is terminated. At this point, candidates begin preparing for actual resettlement. They take part in cultural orientation programming to help prepare them for the transition. Non-government resettlement entities work to determine the best location for resettlement. The candidate does not choose his or her destination state or city. Next, travel is organized. Additional security checks are conducted at this point. Once again, any flags terminate the process. Finally, the candidate arrives in the United States, where a whole new set of processes and chapters of learning begin. Let's review that entire process in brief. 1. The UNHCR identifies candidates and collects essential information. 2. The RSC creates a file for the applicant. 3. The first round of screenings and security checks take place. 4. The candidate interviews with the Department of Homeland Security. 5. Advanced biometrics, including fingerprints or iris scans, are taken. 6. The candidate undergoes a full medical evaluation. 7. He or she takes place in cultural orientation programming and is assigned a final destination. 8. Travel is planned and the candidate is subject to new security screenings. 9. He or she arrives in the United States and is greeted by a representative from the partnering resettlement agency. Now we'll explore what happens post-resettlement. For many, resettlement does not signal an end, but rather a beginning. Those who are new to America are suddenly confronted with a world that is full of unfamiliarity. We may take for granted the many nuances that we consider normative to American life. For many new arrivals, however, U.S. processes and systems are novel. In addition, resettled refugees are expected to learn English and participate in school or the workforce. Meanwhile, they are confronted with the challenge of balancing life in a new country with maintaining their personal and cultural identities. Post-resettlement entities, including those in Colorado, walk beside newly arrived refugees in achieving healthy resettlement outcomes. Incoming individuals and families have vastly different needs, goals, and existing strengths. Colorado's Refugee Service Provider Network reflects this diversity. We'll begin with our core service providers. These organizations make critical preparations for resettled refugees and are there to meet them when they first arrive in Colorado. The Department of State partners with 9 separate nonprofit entities throughout the United States to coordinate refugee resettlement. 3 of those are active here in Colorado: ECDC African Community Center, Lutheran Family Services, and International Rescue Committee. Resettled refugees do have certain requirements that they are expected to work toward post-resettlement. In addition to following the laws of our country, they must attend English language courses, actively seek out employment for adults, or attend school as children. And resettled refugees are also expected to repay the United States government for the initial travel loan. Resettlement agencies, meanwhile, are also responsible for meeting certain objectives. Namely, they must greet the new families, secure initial housing, and aid with successful integration. Because integration is multifaceted, each organization's programming may differ slightly, so that it can be tailored to the unique populations it serves. You can see here some of the ways that resettlement organizations support new arrivals. But of course, it takes a village. Colorado communities rely upon an extensive, interwoven network of refugee network service providers to ensure successful integration for new Americans. Services provided in the first weeks or months of resettlement are just the tip of the iceberg. Throughout our great state, groups of all shapes and sizes bolster healthy integration by providing new arrivals with a range of tools and opportunities to engage in the American experience. Together, these supports make up our village. To date, Colorado boasts almost 50 refugee service providers. Each of these initiatives is made stronger by volunteer presence. You are an important part of the village. Refugees are important social and economic assets to the countries they resettle to, including the United States. Let's take a look at some of the fiscal benefits of adding and retaining refugees in our communities. First, refugees are paying into our taxation systems. With that, they are also contributing to core programs like Social Security and Medicare, filling in critical gaps brought on by our aging U.S. population. Some of the argument against refugee resettlement has to do with the misconception that refugees are a drain on our system. The truth is, refugees who enter the country as adults pay on average $21,000 in taxes above what they receive in benefits over a 20-year period. It is true that household income for refugee families starts off low. After all, new Americans are working through language learning, job training, and in many cases, trauma. However, it doesn't take them long to catch up. A mere 25 years in most cases. In fact, after 25 years, the earnings of refugee families actually surpass those of traditional U.S. families within similar employment settings. New Americans help keep our communities alive and prosperous. In a 9-year period, resettled refugees contributed nearly $41 billion in federal net fiscal benefits and $22 billion to their local economies. They are inclined to entrepreneurial efforts too, surpassing other foreign-born populations in business startups and generating billions of dollars in taxable revenue. From the National Immigration Forum, as research shows, refugees contribute to building our economy and our nation. Refugees are an incredibly valuable economic and fiscal resource. They work hard, start their own businesses, spend money in local economies, and help revitalize struggling communities. At a time when global demand for refugee resettlement is at a record level, a drastic cut in refugee admissions represents a missed opportunity for the U.S. New Americans contribute in many other areas as well. They bring with them new cuisine, fresh ideas and perspectives, language, art, music, entertainment, athletic talents, and professional expertise. By and large, new Americans do well in school, too. Resettled refugees who arrive before the age of 14 are highly likely to graduate alongside their U.S.-born peers. Those arriving before age 13 are more likely to graduate than traditional students. Naturally, it takes time to acquire a new language, 5 to 7 years on average. For many resettled refugees, English is a third or even fourth learned language. Once the language has been acquired, however, refugee newcomer English language learners, or ELLs, as a demographic whole, outperform native speakers in academic achievement testing. It should also be noted that many new Americans come to the U.S. with prior degrees. Frustratingly, these degrees do not always transfer. Sometimes formal documentation was left behind, or cannot be verified because of existing chaos in the home country. Many have expertise in a particular field or trade as well. With this in mind, the prior knowledge that resettled refugees bring with them is one of our greatest untapped resources. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development estimates that some 15% of asylum seekers are college educated, though they predict that number to be higher. Many U.S. communities are eager to share the academic successes of their new neighbors. To address the topic of safety, many separate reports indicate that refugee resettlement actually enhances the safety of the host nation. Special immigrant visa holders, as mentioned before, are one example of this. These individuals risked their lives to aid the United States government in ways that only someone with localized access could accomplish. Perhaps most significantly, refugee Americans are single-handedly rebuilding some of our most depressed neighborhoods and towns and adding new life to communities affected by attrition. This is true in Colorado, where towns such as Aurora, Montrose, Greeley, and Fort Morgan are experiencing the birth of new restaurants, shops, community centers, and schools in areas where resettled refugees are residing. Refugees can and do contribute to society in innumerable ways. We can be intentional in our willingness to learn from them, even as we empower them to learn, work, raise families, engage in civic opportunities, and lead within our communities. Refugees are assets to our country and to Colorado. Just for fun, how many of these well-known refugees do you recognize? Each of these famous individuals has a refugee past and has accomplished great things. As inspiring as these stories are, keep in mind that most new Americans will never make headlines. Yet, in quiet and seemingly mundane ways, they strive to shape our neighborhoods for the better, sharing with us their resiliency and dedication to our country. Refugee newcomers to America, our fathers, mothers, grandparents, sons, daughters, students, employers, employees, degree holders, voters, partners, artists, athletes, professionals, friends, and neighbors. We are human. Big or small, each of us is capable of impact. By engaging with Colorado Refugee Connect, you have taken the first step toward making a difference within Colorado's refugee service community. Congratulations! You have completed Refugee 101 with Colorado Refugee Connect. In a few moments, you will be directed to fill out a quick form indicating that you have completed this course. You will then be able to access your completion certificate. Be sure to bring a copy of your completion certificate with you to your first volunteer match assignment. And of course, be sure to continue to explore and match through Colorado Refugee Connect.